Welcome back to Story Time with Chris James. I will now try to pick up right where I left off. Ham tried drinking a very hot coffee in hopes it would melt the yellow goo. It only ran down the front of her t-shirt. Eddie got a scalpel from his first aid kit and tried cutting through the yellow mess, but the blade broke off and stuck instead. You know, You hold her head. He was pointing to Hortense, who had come down for a cup of coffee and had stayed for the show. I'll push down on her chin. Her teeth should come out of the cheese like substance. Unless her teeth come out of her head. Hortense looked at the yellow goo stuck in Pam's mouth. How about going to see, what's his name? Nashers, the dentist. He kind of owes you a favor or two. How? Pam got up and began staggering to the door. Maybe I should drive you. Hortense ran to grab her purse. Being such a large person, you would expect Medusa to drive a big vehicle. She had a black Volkswagen Bug. The driver's seat was pushed back all the way, hitting up against the rear seat. Her head would have touched the ceiling if it had not been a convertible. Her eyes were visible above the top of the windshield. She got them to the dentist's office in record time. Bubbles was at her desk thumbing through her cell phone when Hortense leaned in close and asked, "Is the dentist in and can he see my friend right this second? Or do I need to rearrange things?" The implied threat was more than implied. Pam had saved her life a few times, and it was now her chance to pay back a small amount of her debt. Bubbles looked up at the giant in all black and quickly scooted out of her chair. "I'll just check if he can." The rest was lost in the distance as Bubbles bounced out the door of her office and ran to find her boss. After just a few seconds, Bubbles was back. "The doctor said he'll see you right away." She walked over to the door and opened it. As Pam walked through, Bubbles couldn't help but think she looked familiar. As Medusa walked in, Bubbles pressed herself back against the wall. The giant was only 6 foot 8 inches tall, but she could project a much bigger image should the needs arise. Pam sat across the desk from the doctor. "I must thank you for taking care of my little problem. So what is it I can do for you?" Pam pulled her lips back, showing him the yellow goo that was now dry and hard as cement. "Oh my, that looks quite unappetizing." He grabbed a metal pick and tried poking at the icky stuff. Maybe we should move you to one of the exam rooms." When talking to a patient, he liked to refer to himself in the plural because it sounded like there were several people who all agreed with his decisions. He opened the door and ushered Pam over to one of the exam rooms. As Hortense was about to step into the room, he held up one hand. "Only patients and next of kin allowed." She gave him one of her looks. In that case, please be my guest." The doctor ushered the black-clad giant into what was now a very small room. Pam found herself on one of those chairs that leaned way back. As her feet came up, the chair began to vibrate, making her whole body shake. A TV came on, in view, mounted on the ceiling. An old movie was playing, something called The Marathon Man. Starring Dustin Hoffman. Laurence Olivier was saying something about, "Is it safe?" Dr. Nashers put on some magnifying goggles and looked closely at Pam's teeth. Hmm, followed by, "Oh my." which was then turned into, "You do brush and floss every day." He poked the steel-tipped instrument into the yellow goo. He tried to pull it back out, only to find the probe was now stuck. He grabbed the drill and he tried making a hole in the yellow, unknown substance. After the first few seconds, the drill was stuck as well. Oh, this is just fascinating. Pam now had a probe and a drill hanging from her mouth. Pam noticed Hortense was standing right behind the doctor, looking over his shoulder. With each instrument that got stuck, her face got closer. Dr. Nashers reached over and grabbed a pair of pliers. "I might have to try pulling one of your teeth." Pam tried to scoot away from him as the pliers came closer to her mouth. She tried to slide sideways off the chair, only to bump up against the armrests. "No!" came out unbidden, along with a yellow mold of her teeth. The yellow goo fell from her mouth onto the front of her shirt. The doctor looked down at it. Hortense looked down at it. Pam tried to look down, but her head was back too far. Laurence Olivier asked, "Is it safe?" "There's something you don't see every day." Nashers picked up the yellow tooth mold and examined it. As Pam was about to walk out the door, Bubbles held up an invoice. "Will that be cash or credit card?" Pam didn't bring any cash with her, and as far as credit goes, well, her parents had put an end to that. That night they had gone to see that Dave guy who talked about plastic surgery, and they had cut up her cards. Medusa pulled a handful of paper from her purse. We can exchange that for our ghost removal bill. I think you'll owe us a few more visits to make up the difference." Hortense flipped through the paper in her hand. "Let's see here. Ghost investigation charge, a ghost removal charge, a ghost containment charge, ghost return to dentist's office charge." Bubbles quickly changed gears. "How about I send you the invoice and you send us yours sometime next week?" "Yes, let's do that." Medusa steered Pam out the door and into her car. "I didn't know you had our invoices with you." Pam was impressed. "I don't. That was my cell phone bill. I figured the receptionist wouldn't know the difference." As they pulled into the dirt parking lot, Pam noticed Belle's cauldron was laying in the grass. The yellow goo was still stuck inside, along with the boat oar. Al was standing near it, poking at the yellow goo with a stick. "Hey, Pam, I'm glad you're back. I wanted to ask you, who does this thing belong to?" He poked the cauldron to show what the thing he was talking about was. "It used to belong to Belle, but it looks like she might need a new one." Al squatted down close to the opening. He put one hand on the oar, which came out and fell to the ground. "Hmm." Al carefully poked the yellow goo with one finger. Seeing that his finger didn't dissolve or get stuck, he used the depression where the oar had been, and he grabbed the goo with both hands. As he pulled, the cauldron moved as well. "Could you hold this thing while I pull?" Pam was about to grab the huge black cooking crucible when Medusa stepped in front of her and put her foot down. Literally. She put one foot on the cauldron. Al pulled. With a plopping sound, the yellow goo popped out, still in the shape of the inside of the cooking vessel. "I don't know what this stuff is, but I think there might be some use for it." He got that thinking hard look on his face. "Maybe in industry, or maybe the military." He hefted the yellow goo, finding it not as heavy as he had expected. "I need to show this to Doug." He noticed the blank looks on Pam's face. "You know, my former boss, now business partner." I'll bet we can find some use for it. He held the yellow goo to his chest and headed for the front door. Pam looked from her dad to the cauldron. I wonder why that stuff came loose. Medusa looked at Pam and then the cauldron and then back at Pam. You tried to eat that stuff about an hour ago, right? Belle turned the heat off right after your teeth got stuck. It must have something to do with time. The yellow goo only sticks for about an hour or so. We should take this pot back to Belle. Pam looked at the face Medusa was making. Well, she didn't know that gunk she was making would glue my teeth together. That witch has been nothing but trouble since you hired. I know, she doesn't work for you, but it's still like everybody works for you. Oh, come on, she's not that bad. Pam had just spent way too much time with Belle while trying to stay alive and not fulfill her marriage vows. That whole till death do you part and all, which did almost happen several times. Give me a hand. Pam got down and grabbed the huge black tub. Medusa didn't much care for doing anything that might be misunderstood as a nice thing for that denizen of the basement, but she also wanted to help Pam out, especially since she still owed her for several rescues. The pot turned out to be a lot heavier than either of them had expected. How did Belle get this thing out of the basement? Pam asked. They managed to get it up and start a slow stagger towards the front door. Halfway there, it became too much. Drop it before we kill ourselves, Medusa managed to gasp. Pam let go of her side just seconds before Medusa, so the pot landed sideways. It began to roll across the dirt, heading right for where Mr. Carbuncle's crew were building a new entrance. Pam yelled, and several workers had to jump to the side as a mostly round cooking pot rolled towards them, went through the hole in the wall, and disappeared. Pam and Hortense went running to see if the pot had survived the trip. It was 20 feet to the floor of the basement. At the hole in the wall, they looked down. No shattered cooking pot. It had kept rolling halfway to the old coal room. Well, that saves us a bunch of work, Pam said, trying to make the best of what could have been a bad thing. Pam climbed down into the basement using one of the workers' ladders. Medusa had some difficulty making the same trip since her dress is not ladder friendly. Her black knee-length ensemble hung down just enough to get between her boots and the rungs. She had to keep pulling the satin out of the way so she didn't rip anything. They walked over to where the pot had finally stopped rolling. Instead of trying to carry the thing, Medusa just pushed it onto its side and began rolling the pot back to its owner. Belle looked at Pam as if she might be in some kind of trouble. Not my fault. I think I used too much elastine. Maybe just a drop or two. Well, at least you don't need a new cooking pot. My dad wants to talk to you about how you made that yellow stuff. He thinks it might be usable for something. Do you have the ingredients written down, or was this just off the top of your head? It's all in my cookbook. Belle pointed out a huge old looking book. It was actually brand new, and she'd been adding recipes and spells as she went, as she'd bought it just a year ago. Belle had drugged the book back and forth in the street to give it that well worn look any old witch book should have. Pam's eyes roamed the shelves all around the former coal room turned witch's office. What kind of spices do you have? Anything my mom might need for cooking? Pam looked at the hundreds of tiny and big and huge and enormous containers all lurking in the darkness. Belle looked at her collection. I have dried bat wing, a zombie dandruff, cat's meow. How about a jar of pickled toenails? Pam didn't think her mom could use any of these ingredients. Salt, pepper, mustard, ketchup. I have salt drawn from the mouth of a zombie. It was used to kill it again. Belle got a worried look. I hope I didn't bring it back to life. Come with me and talk to my dad. Maybe there's a few bucks in it for you. Hortense excused herself from them, saying she had more cheese investigations to do. Pam and Belle, carrying her book, headed over to where Al's new business was being set up. There was no building, not even any walls yet. On the ground were lines showing where everything would be someday. A folding table was sitting just inside the front few lines. There were lines running around a bunch of huge coolers, or maybe they were ovens. A sign hung from the door saying, "Don't touch," in big black letters. A severe looking woman dressed in a gray uniform that looked more like a uniform sat behind the table watching the pair as they approached. Uh, Howdy. I need to see my dad, Al Bogus. Pam considered using her world leader Pam voice, but felt it was inappropriate just to see her dad. Do you have an appointment? The severe looking woman gave the two a look that implied that they probably didn't. He's my dad. I don't need a. Mr. Bogus is an extremely busy man, and he doesn't have time to interact with Untermensch. Just then Al looked up from the table he was standing at, along with his former boss, now business partner, Doug. They were both examining the yellow goo. Pam could see writing on the floor in front of the table. Somebody had written "Research and Development Room" in black letters. Ah, Pam, and Belle. We met at the New Year's Eve party. Al said this just in case the witch didn't recognize him from just 3 weeks ago. Al and Doug were both wearing white lab coats. Each had an ID badge hung from the lanyard around their necks. They also both had on white shirts with black neckties. Belle didn't trust anybody in a lab coat or who wore neckties. Something she got from her parents, who were both hippies. It's all right, Miss Oberhair. Pam can come see me any time. She needs to pass through security first. Then we'll see. Mrs. Oberhair spoke with a very thick German accent. Al just looked at his daughter as if to say, "Well, rules are rules." Mrs. Oberhair looked at Pam closely. "Name?" she demanded. She pulled a huge book over to her and began looking up anything under P and then B, followed by D for daughter. As she searched for any unfavorable results that might bar Pam from entering the building to B, Al walked over. He was careful to follow the lines on the floor and use the places where door was written. When you said modern technology didn't work here, I thought you were just being a bit anomalous, like the name. So we tried. He pointed to a pile of computers over by the back of the building to be. Smoke was coming from several. Most had cracked screens, and one looked as if it was melted. Once we realized you were right, we had to go old school. He pointed to the book Mrs. Oberhair was looking through. The severe looking woman reached under the table and pulled a box up. Here is your visitor's pass. Keep it on you at all times. You are only allowed to be in any room as long as you are accompanied by one of the staff. If you are found wandering around, you will be dealt with severely. She laid the pass on the table, slid it across to Pam. Pam hung the pass around her neck and was about to follow her dad when Mrs. Oberhair gave Belle a look. Name? Belle Blizzard, witch extraordinaire. Belle thought it was time to use her fancy made-up title. Mrs. Oberhair opened the book to B, followed by W, and then E. She looked at Belle. It says here that is not your real name. Your real name is Tinker Bell Snowflake, and you are Untermensch. Belle had a shocked look on her face. I am not what was that thing? An underwitch? Out before I call security and have you placed against the wall. Mrs. Oberhair looked as if this was the one thing that she most enjoyed. Al thought maybe it was time for him to intercede. It's quite all right, Mrs. Oberhair. Bell is a consultant who we need to consult with. Al hoped he wasn't starting to sound like his brother. I'll take full responsibility for her, and I'll keep her out of trouble. Mrs. Oberhair looked as if she might just overrule her boss. She looked closely at Al and then at Belle. She pulled one of the visitor passes from the box and placed it on the table, nowhere near Belle. Here is your visitor's pass. Keep it on you at all times. You are only allowed to be in any room as long as you are accompanied by one of the staff. If you are found wandering around, you will be dealt with severely. Belle wanted to give this woman a nasty look, but she was too afraid of what just might happen. She grabbed the pass and hung it around her neck. Al led his two young visitors back to the R&D room. As they stepped into the room to be built, he stopped near where the door would be someday, and he looked back at Mrs. Oberhair. It looked like he carefully closed the door that wasn't there. In a whisper, he said, Mrs. Oberhair can be a little bit strict at times, but she's the best receptionist when it comes to keeping the riffraff out. He glanced back to be sure she wasn't listening. She came highly recommended by Mr. Armstrong. Al and Doug stood on one side of the table, Belle and Pam on the other. The reason we invited y'all here today is we want to know what is this mystery substance and how is it made? He directed the question to both young women, even though Pam had no idea how it was made or what it was. Belle looked at Pam as if she expected her to answer. She looked at Al and then at Doug. Um, it's mostly latex, copper, sand, a few secret herbs and spices like curcumin, barberry, ginger, cumin, mustard, bat's wing, gold fungus, things like that. Pam couldn't contain herself any longer. What can this yellow goo have to do with food processing? Al looked as if he was about to say something with far-reaching ramifications. Remember what your mom said about our outside-the-box ideas? It's something like that. Al wondered exactly when would be the right time to tell his one and only daughter what it was that he did to earn a living. Would she believe him or think he'd lost it? Was now a good time, seeing as she was standing in his place of development? While this discussion was going on, Doug had taken a hammer from a pile of tools laying on the floor near where the floor said workbench in black letters. He tried hitting the yellow goo a few times, just a bit harder each time. When nothing happened, he went and got a drill and he tried making a hole in the stuff. Not an electric drill, but a hand-cranked one. The bit wouldn't bite into the goo. With a look of deep concentration on his face, Doug walked over to the pile of tools and he pulled a revolver from the bottom. He walked over to the far wall, turned and aimed in on the yellow mass. As he was about to pull the trigger, Al looked up. You think this is the right time or the place for that? Oh, I was just wanting to see if this stuff would stop a bullet. He looked around at the total lack of walls or any kind of safety arrangements. Maybe I guess I should wait. Al looked at Bell. Can you make more of this? We need to come up with a name for this stuff. I can't just keep calling it goo. The four got busy trying different names like Nasty Goo and Plastigunk. Pam soon realized she had a few things to do that might be more important than naming Bell's stuff. Bell's stuff? That sounded like a good name. She excused herself as Doug was saying they should put Bell on the payroll as a part of staff so they wouldn't have to go through the security check each time they needed to talk to her. Pam stopped off at Miss Oberhair's desk to drop off her visitor's pass. The woman gave Pam a look as if she might be trying to steal something. Next time you will use the door, or there will be severe consequences, the woman said. Pam had simply stepped over one of the black lines. Mr. Gigante was in the middle of a gym class doing push ups. He was saying, 1, 2, 3, followed by a pause as if he expected an answer. He would look around at the invisible class. The only person visible was Dorothy, who was still dressed in her county issue pajamas and dressing gown. Pam could see there were several ghosts dressed in exercise outfits following along. As Mr. Gigante would pause, they would all chant, 4. She waved at a few that she recognized. Pam stopped off at Hildy's desk and picked up her post-its. Mrs. Cassavetes wanted to know about her husband. Mr. Chat wanted to know about the cheese. Mrs. Sandtiger was inquiring about all the missing spices. She kind of hinted about the grade increase to go along with solving the mystery. In the last year, Pam had gone from a steady C average to a good solid B, mostly because of all the missing students she had found and the psychic work she had done for some of the teachers. At least Dr. Nasher was still fully satisfied. No more moaning and groaning to scare off his patients. The last post-it looked odd. It was very cryptic looking, written in some language Pam wasn't familiar with. It didn't look like Hildy's handwriting. Pam was about to ask about the note when she saw the word "No" appear at the bottom of the paper. Oh, wow! Magic writing! Pam looked at Hildy to see if that last had been out loud. The receptionist was busy looking for something in the bottom drawer, but she gave Pam the side eye. Just thinking out loud. Pam took the note and headed for her office, which didn't exist yet either. Pam went into the one and only bedroom in the building. That is, the only room that had been built to be a bedroom that still had a bed. Keep in mind the mansion was built to live in, not to work in. The yard goat did sleep here once in a while, but right now the room was unoccupied. Pam sat on the edge of the bed and tried to decipher the writing. As she looked at it, the scratches and lines took on a shape of English words. Come see me right away. Don't talk to anybody about this. Followed by the big no at the bottom. It was signed Madam Dingus. Ever since she was eaten and then regurgitated by a giant onion, Madam Dingus had been especially nice to everyone. As she had stopped wearing that purple turban, opting to let her hair go a little gray, and as she dressed more like a normal person. Her ability to read the cards had improved by a lot, especially considering before being swallowed whole, she'd had about as much psychic ability as a light bulb. To say she was faking it wasn't right. It was more like she wanted to be psychic and she acted as if she were psychic, even dressing like she had abilities. Those who paid for her services all thought the madam was correct, and when she wasn't, it was because somehow fate had been changed by knowing what was going to happen, and therefore it didn't. Pam took the fancy staircase up to the second floor. She said hello to everyone she passed, waving if they looked busy. Next, she took the not so fancy staircase to the third floor. This had been where the children and the staff had their rooms, back when some guy named McKinley had been president. Pam found the right door. It was the one of the smallest, less attractive offices. She knocked on the door and thought she heard somebody sneaking around on the other side. The sound of the deadbolt being slid open was followed by the sound of a lock being unlocked. The door opened to just a crack and an eyeball looked out. The eyeball was familiar, mounted on a face. Madame Dingus was looking at Pam. Then she looked back and forth to be sure that she was alone. The madam whispered, "Don't say anything. Shh." The door swung open and the madam ushered Pam into her office. The door was quickly closed and the locks were all re-engaged. Pam looked around the room. The window that looked out to the back yard had a heavy blanket nailed up over it. The mirror was covered with newspaper, taped in place with about a half a roll of duct tape. The headline stated the folks in Washington were telling the citizens to simply ignore the cheese and the spice shortage and they would go away by themselves. The air vent, actually just a hole in the floor with a grate over it, was covered with a stack of books. Pam whispered, "What's going on? And I hope you're not going crazy." She slapped one hand over her mouth, realizing that she'd said the last bit out loud. Madame Dingus looked around her office and then back at Pam. "I hope not. The cards have been showing me things." She indicated the tarot cards laid out on the card table in the center of the room. Tarot cards don't actually show people anything. It's all in the interpretation of the reader. When I sat down to do a reading just this Monday, I saw things in my mind. Strange things. I thought I was having a dream, only I was still awake. Madame Dingus looked a second to gather her thoughts. I saw beings from other galaxies who wanted to take over the world. They wanted to enslave us, treating us like objects. A shudder ran through her body. Pam flipped her imaginary coin to decide if she should tell the madam anything. She caught it in her mind and saw that she should. Tell, that is. There are several alien races visiting our planet all the time. Most seem to be here to watch us and see what we're doing. They can be a bit scary, but I haven't run into any that want to enslave us yet. Madame Dingus didn't miss a beat. "I saw them coming into your home. They were there to scope things out." She looked around the office to be sure they were still alone. "They have a base close to us. It's huge and it's filled with all their otherworldly devices of enslavement." She looked around once more, just in case. Pam was beginning to look around for anyone or anything trying to listen in. She was feeling Madame Dingus's paranoia now. What did these aliens look like? I've had grays coming and going from my closet for about a week now. These were fuzzy looking. Not fuzzy like a cat, but they were out of focus, like all those videos you see where the camera is out of focus. Pam got real close to Madame Dingus and whispered, "Can you find out where their base is located? If we know where they are coming and going from, maybe we can do something to stop their evil plans." They both looked around the office for eavesdroppers. Pam remembered a question that she wanted to ask. "How did you make that note in magic writing?" Madame Dingus just looked at her. "What magic writing?" "The post-it note you left for me on Hildy's desk." "I didn't leave a note. I thought you just dropped by for a visit." They both looked around the office again. Pam went to see Dolores to see if she could find any information about missing spices. Dolores sat in her office chair with her face just inches from her favorite mirror. She tried looking from left to right and then right to left. Finally, she stood up and looked down from above. "There are plenty of spices in town. Tons of them, really. I can see shelf after shelf of little bottles and jars, but I can't get a location." Pam had a sudden thought that she thought might be a good idea. "If I were to get close to the place where all the spice is hidden, could you tell me?" Dolores thought about this for a minute. "Maybe. If you were to drive around town, say in a huge circle, maybe I could tell you which direction they are from where you are." "Let's try it and see. What's the worst thing that can happen?" First things first, Dolores was going to need a mirror, not just inside the bag office. There was no way they could communicate other than smoke signals. Dolores grabbed her best handheld mirror and walked out to the dirt parking lot. She sat down on the porch swing where the Civil War soldier usually hung out and got busy scrying by looking in her mirror. Pam jumped in her pickup and pulled out of the lot and onto the street. She was at the end of the street when Dolores called. "Do I call you anytime I see something or wait for you to call me when you're ready?" Pam had to hold her cell phone using her right shoulder and her cheek so she could shift gears and still hold the steering wheel. "What we need is a third person to do the communicating while I drive." "Who can we get? Just about everybody is busy doing psychic stuff, except Mikey Baba Ganoush. He's sound asleep." Dolores walked over and looked in through the door at the status board just in case any of the staff had finished and were looking for something to do. She noticed Prince Wapo was sitting in the middle of Hildy's desk. He was trying to push everything off as Hildy kept trying to keep things from hitting the floor. "If only we had some way of—" Pam had one of those thoughts that came from nowhere and made her think she should work on her thinking ability. She drove around the block and back into the parking lot. "Hop in. You can just tell me from the cab." Pam couldn't help but think about the time just a little while ago that her and Hortense had driven around with all this confusion. Dolores was wondering why she hadn't thought of this first. "How about taking a loop around town and see what I see?" Pam drove back out of the parking lot and headed for the edge of town. They lived in either a small city or a big town, so it didn't take long. As they were driving, they passed a man in a chef's outfit. He was standing on a street corner holding a sign. It said, "Need spices to cook." He had a very sad look on his face. The local pizza place had a sign saying, "Need cheese, no questions asked." The parking lot was empty. They got onto the loop and they began driving and looking. Pam kept her attention on the traffic and Dolores kept her eyes on her mirror. "We need to go right, I think." Pam took the next corner and kept going. "Anything?" I can see something dark around the edges, but it's fuzzy and I can't focus. Dolores was wondering if she should have grabbed her black mirror instead. Ah, I got something. Quick, turn here. Dolores pointed to the right as they were approaching an intersection. She gazed hard into the mirror. Right again. She tried turning her head to the side while holding the mirror higher. Okay, one more right. There's definitely something there. Maybe. Okay, one more right. She took just a second to look at where they were driving. Weren't we just here a second ago? Pam looked at the intersection coming up. We turned here and then there. She pointed with one finger while cruising through the intersection. Dolores felt deflated. How about the next left? Pam followed the directions coming from Dolores and her scrying. They proceeded to take the next three lefts, finding themselves passing the same intersection once again. There was another false alarm as they were passing a used car lot. One of the salesmen was holding a sign that said, "Condiments, $5." He was holding a shoebox full of ketchup, mustard, and hot sauce packets found under the seats of the cars in the lot. Dolores had picked up on the box a block away. She had some disparaging comments about some car salesmen and used cars in general. After driving the entire length of the street, they came to the other side of the loop. Well, the old abandoned quarry is just ahead. The place where we battled the demon Waldo? That must have been ages ago. Dolores thought about it. No, it was just 8 months ago. My, how time flies when you're facing death and destruction. The sun was nearing the horizon, and they both had to get home. Pam, so Paula wouldn't say anything about working so much, and Dolores had a hot date with a glazier. Her mirror had shown all kinds of unexplained things. Unfortunately, none of them had been spices or cheese. Mr. Armstrong didn't have to get home. He didn't have to answer to his mother. She was away from town. She was away from the country. She was somewhere in the Philippines looking for lost treasure. As for hot dates, he was taking a breather from those ever since his last date had turned out to have several warrants out for her arrest. He discovered she was responsible for dozens of men being turned into zombies. She then put them to work in her warehouse as unpaid and overworked slaves. Although he would never admit it, he did feel just a bit bad about handcuffing her, followed by tying her up and leaving her on the steps at the police station. Tonight, he was sitting in his office in the dark, waiting. The portal Pam had dropped off was nailed to the wall of his office, in between his rifle racks and the ammo shelves. There was just about the only space not covered with guns or things that made guns fun to use. The sound of feet crunching over the salt was barely audible. The salt he had sprinkled on the floor earlier. He counted to 5 and then he pulled the cord that was attached to one side of the portal, collapsing it in onto a pile of wires. Flipping on the lights, he came face to face with 4 graves. We meet again, eh, boys? Dinner was meatloaf, using curry powder instead of salt and pepper, or brown sugar, or ketchup. Pam wished they'd had a dog so she could con the meal off on some unsuspecting four-legged friend under the table. Instead, it was piled in her napkin that was stationed in her lap. The liquid had leaked through, and now it was a bit of a problem. Her dad spent half of his time telling Paula about Belle and her bizarre new invention. Something to do with body armor or just plain armor. Him and Doug were trying to get the goo in other colors, preferably green or brown. The other half of his time was spent pushing the food around on his plate. A question was scratching at the inside of Pam's head. She finally had to ask, just what kind of food preparation do you do that involves armor? Al looked at Paula, as if to say, now what? Paula looked back as if saying, don't ask me, she's your kid. Once the pause had become very uncomfortable, he said, well, we work on things like a stove that cooks your food as soon as you put it in. Like a microwave? No, more like a time machine. You put the turkey in and hit cook. The machine sends the bird back a few hours and cooks it so you get a fully cooked meal in seconds. It's all about time management. Once he was talking, Al found it was hard to stop. We also make an oven that sends the food far away. It's for folks who constantly burn things. It keeps the smoke out of their houses. And you sell these things to people? Sometimes. A lot of the things we make are bought by the government. They use them for their own purposes. Al began to think there was something really odd about the way the government kept buying things that never seemed to be used by anyone. After doing the dishes, Pam had to take another shower. Her pants were going to need a good long soaking to get the grease out of them. As she was climbing into bed looking forward to a full night's sleep, her phone rang. The caller ID said unknown, which probably meant it was either the bag office or somebody wanting to sell her an extended warranty on her pickup. She wanted to ignore the thing, but her finger hit answer while her mind was saying, don't touch it. I had a visitor from your friends. It was Mr. Armstrong. He didn't need to identify himself on a phone call since his voice was so recognizable. I shut down the portal and they all deflated. It looks like a pile of dust on the floor. Can't even draw a chalk outline around them. He sounded disappointed, mostly about the chalk line. That would have really added something to his decor. They did leave behind their weird wand. One of them tried throwing it at the wall where the portal would have been. I don't know what it does or how it operates, but I know a guy who might. The line went dead. Several months ago, Pam would have thought something had gone wrong and she'd be worried about the semi licensed investigator. Now she knew that he'd run out of things to say and simply hung up. Pam set her phone on the charger and fell asleep. Chapter 9 Sunday. Pam awoke with a start. There was something wrong. She looked around her room, but didn't see anything dangerous or even chancy. She looked at the closet door. The deadbolt was engaged. Her cell phone was right where she'd placed it. She looked at the time. It was 7 a.m. She carefully pulled back the blankets and sheet. There was no horse head or anything that she hadn't gone to bed with. She did notice she was wearing mismatched socks. Maybe it's under the bed, she whispered inside her head. She thought hard about it. Each morning she would roll over and get up on the right-hand side of her bed. Moving quickly, she bounded from the mattress and landed on the floor to the left. Not wanting to, she ducked down and looked under the bed. Oh my God, what a mess! I need to clean that up someday. There was no way anything not connected to her life, could fit under there. It was a solid wall of things that she had been convinced had been lost or stolen. Now I know where just about everything is. She did all the things an older girl who was almost a young woman did in the morning. Once finished, she went downstairs to see what was for breakfast. Paula looked over her shoulder as her youngest came walking into the kitchen. Her hand stealthily moved over to where the knives were kept. Who are you and what have you done with my kid? She spun around holding the biggest knife. Pam was surprised. Mom, it's me, honest. Paula looked her up and down. My kid has never gotten up early, let alone on time, and she never gets up on the weekends without threats. Al was sitting at the end of the table, watching the exchange of words. Pam, if it's really you, what do you get if you multiply 6 times 7? I don't know. You know I'm bad at math. What is this? A multiple guess question? Pam wanted to run, but she didn't know where to. Also, she felt really bad thinking of running from her mother. You can relax, it's her. He thought about this a bit. This is the real Pam. No alien have done a body snatcher exchange on us. He made a mental note to check under Pam's bed for any of those outer space pods just in case. As Pam was relaxing, she suddenly realized the answer was 42. She kept her mouth shut so her folks would think she was the real her, which she was. Al went back to his paper. It says here the president is asking everybody in the country to stop calling Congress demanding that they do something about the cheese and spice shortage. He says we should just get used to not having any. He read a bit more. The CDC has announced we're probably better off not eating so much cheese, and those spices are all probably dangerous anyway. Pam found it odd to actually have food in her stomach before running out the door en route to wherever she needed to be. There were no sounds coming from her abdomen during church. Paula didn't want Pam heading over to the office after lunch, but once told she was working on tracking down the missing spices and cheese, Paula decided that this was one time that her youngest and her oldest really should work harder. Pam had a new plan, and she wanted to see if it would work, but first she had to pick up Sarah. Once at the office, she went to the coffee shop to see if everybody was there. Dolores was sitting at the bar, nursing a huge cup of coffee. Her date had run late, as in just finishing up a few hours ago. Hortense was there with several of her best snow globes ready for the search. Bill Palmerhausen was there as well with a couple of his Rolodexes. Mr. Armstrong had 2 shotguns, a few rifles, a box of handguns sitting on a table next to the bar. He also brought his favorite matching set of 1911 45s. He handed out whichever firearm he felt the person could handle. Dolores was handed a 45. Medusa had her own firearm, given her by her grandfather, hidden in her fancy black outfit. Somewhere. Mr. Armstrong looked at Pam. He looked at Sarah, and then he looked at Bill. Here, you might need this. He passed over a 9mm. Don't shoot yourself or anybody on our side. Do you think this is necessary? Pam indicated the pistol. We are dealing with desperate folks here. When food gets short, people are willing to do crazy things in order to make their lives right once more. Si vis pisum parabellum. Pam was about to ask what this meant when her mind dug deep and came up with, to live in peace, prepare for war. She wondered why she knew that. Madame Dingus came walking in, followed by Naomi Cuthbert. Naomi had given up scrying ever since that incident involving missing students and a bowl of water. Now she used a pendulum instead. It took a lot longer to get answers since she could mostly only do yes or no questions, but she felt much safer. She was now the senior person at the agency, having spent 20 years in a semi-coma state that Mr. Thresher's house. But she was still on the clock. Her back pay was tremendous. Mr. Armstrong issued them each a weapon. Manuel Vargas was the last one there. He'd actually arrived early, but was getting the company car out and ready for action. This ready for action involved removing the 8-track tape player and replacing it with an MP3 player. He didn't want to spend the day listening to King Crimson, a singing 21st century schizoid man. The 9 of them were going to split up into 4 vehicles and drive around town. Those with second sight abilities would focus on spice and cheese. Those with other abilities would do most of the driving. They would keep in touch using two-way radios that were borrowed from the fire department. You may ask why the fire department was allowing civilians to use their equipment. Every fire station comes equipped with a place to park fire engines and a kitchen. Most firefighters were better cooks than folks that worked at restaurants. The whole spice and cheese shortage was making them mad, and you don't want a bunch of mad firefighters who drove huge trucks and carried axes. Mr. Armstrong swung by and asked, and they were more than happy to help out. They were also more than happy to not go looking for weird things. That clay monster statue incident last Halloween was more paranormal than they liked. Everybody ready then? Let's go find the cheese. Nobody leaped to their feet, yelling. Instead, they simply headed out to the parking lot. Madam Dingus was going to drive, while Dolores did her scrying thing. Mr. Armstrong was going to take Medusa. They made quite a pair. Between them, they put a lot of weight on his suspension. Naomi was driving Manuel around using the company car, the 1970 black Cadillac station wagon, better known as a hearse. Having spent so much time unconscious, her driver's license had expired. She had spent most of last month trying to get her life back together. Eddie had taken her out in the company car to get her driving skills back. Talk about the wrong vehicle. Uh, the engine had been supercharged. It would go from 0 to 90 in less than a city block. Somehow they had both survived her driving test, was still being talked about down at the DMV. Bill was going to ride with Pam and Sarah, who was there to document the search. Several Rolodexes were sitting on the dashboard while Bill held one and flipped through the images. He could only find what he could see. Picture after picture of spices were being examined, followed by more images. Some were in jars or bottles, while others were spread out on countertops. As he looked, Bill discovered he was getting hungry. Sarah didn't much care for having to sit in the back, but Pam had pointed out that Bill needed to be close to the action, or at least she thought that might help. Everybody already knew where to begin. Now all they needed to do was find the missing food items and save dinner. They started driving in 4 separate directions. Each team was going to drive up or down every street in their area. If they spotted anything odd or interesting, they would check in out and mark it on their GPS. If it turned out to be something important, the location could be sent to the others right away. Bill soon picked up on something. There seems to be a large chunk of something we might ought to look into, and it's just ahead. He was excited, hoping to be the one to solve the mystery of things tasting good not being available. Not knowing how to cook, he was relegated to eating things that other folks made. Lately, he'd considered become a vegetarian since cheeseburgers and pizzas now tasted like cardboard and dish soap. His focus was drawn towards the back of a hardware store. Bill used his unusual gift to direct Pam over to where the dumpster sat. It's in there. He pointed to the huge metal container. All 3 of them jumped out and walked over to the trash receptacle. In here? No idea what it might be? Pam had an aversion to opening just any trash container, At least this one didn't smell too bad. I was looking at a salt box and my senses were pulled to this place. Bill wanted to see what he had found, but he didn't want to be the one who opened the hatch, just in case. In case there was something inside that could be dangerous. Sarah reached up and pulled the side door open. She had to stand on her toes to see inside. Well, there's a bag that says salt on it. She pulled an empty water softener bag from the dumpster. Shucks! Bill looked disappointed. He took the bag and was going to shove it back in where he had found it. Wait, there's a few small particles in the bottom. Pam was looking in and saw a few sparkles of salt. Maybe we should hang on to this, just in case. Pam folded the bag up and carefully put it under her seat. I am going to break here. I will carry on next week with further adventures of the Bag Company being attacked by UFOs. Until next Saturday, or next week, I should say, this is Chris James for Story Time.